So welcome to the Hong Kong U Methods Hub seminar series. My name is Dodo Xu, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Hong Kong U. And on Professor Chen Dola's behalf, I'm going to be the moderator today. So this time, we're delighted to have Dr. Siwei Cheng from NYU as our guest speaker. So Dr. Chen is now Associate Professor of Sociology at NYU and also a William T. Grant Scholar, right? She received her PhD in both sociology and public policy, and also MA in statistics from the University of Michigan, where we first met. And before that, she received her BA in economics as well as the statistics from Peking U. So a loss to econ, but a gain to sociology. So Dr. Chen's research primarily focuses on inequality, mobility, labor market, and also quantitative methodology. And her work has appeared in many leading journals, including AJS, ASR, Social Forces, PNAS, Demography, among many others. So personally, I think Siwei is one of the smartest young sociologists of our time. And I'm also a big fan of her work. So today we're very lucky to hear about her most recent research on activity space using large-scale human mobility data collected by mobile phones in the US. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Siwei Cheng. So all yours, Siwei.
Thank you so much, Dodo and Tarani, for the kind invitation, and Dodo for the very generous introduction. I'm definitely flattered. I think I'm just very fortunate to learn from a lot of my friends and colleagues that we, are doing similar research on inequality, and I'm so happy to see some of you in the audience. So hi, friends, old and new. Thanks for having me here. And today, let me actually share my screen. Everyone seeing the screen all right? Good? Okay, perfect. Okay, so today you'll be hearing me saying a lot about cases where space, like physical space, doesn't matter. And I think this talk is a perfect example of that, because we are definitely far away in terms of physical space, but we got to share this activity space, which is a virtual space, but where real interactions and research sharing and questions are happening. So thanks again. I really appreciate this opportunity. So I'm going to present a paper, or actually a bunch of papers, and there's kind of my relatively new research project on activity space and on mobility networks. So it's, I put "and other stories" in the title just to make sure there can be more than one paper presented. But I'm going to focus more on this relatively more recent work on the effect of economic inequality on activity space segregation. So this work is joined with Yongjun Zhang from Stony Brook and Jenna Shaw, who is a grad student in our department. So let me give you a preview of this talk. So I'm planning to do three things. So the first part of my talk, I want to talk about segregation in two spaces, the residential space and activity space. I'll talk about what has been done, a very brief review, but I'll focus more on what I think, or we think, the activity space research can contribute to the overall understanding of segregation. I'll also talk about the specific project about economic inequality and how that is shaping the geography of segregation in people's activity space. So I'll share evidence on that. And then I want to spend some time talking about what we're going to do moving this forward, what we're going to do next. And I'm going to share some results from ongoing work that are looking at activity space segregation in relation to intergenerational mobility, as well as political polarization and segregation. The main part of this project is funded by the William T. Grant Foundation, so they should be in the management. So let's start. So I don't think we need to spend too much time on trying to convince you that segregation in residential space is important for inequality and stratification. An extensive literature has studied this area. So basically, the idea is that the sorting of individuals or groups into different residential locations, so different places where they actually live, as well as the communities or neighborhood surrounding that locations. It's an important mechanism for producing and reproducing inequality, for shaping people's life chances. So theoretically, an area is viewed as segregated if different groups are disproportionately allocated to different residential neighborhoods. So people from different social and economic backgrounds live in different neighborhoods. There has been tons of research showing that segregation is associated with a variety of negative outcomes, such as poverty, reduced social mobility, segregation in schools, violence and crime, and more recently, political polarization. So segregation is a long-standing topic in sociology and demography. But most of the work so far has focused on residential space. And I'm saying most of the work because I think it'd be unfair to say that scholars has only recently started to look at segregation beyond residential space. In fact, if you survey the literature, there has been a long-standing work in demography, sociology, as well as broader geography, public health studies that specifically emphasized how much where people spend their time matters for their well-being, such as their income, their job opportunities, as well as their health. So activity space has been long-standing in terms of theory and also in terms of empirical work. But as I'll discuss more today, most of the work so far has focused more on survey data or data that focus on a relatively smaller range of areas. So there's a strong data demand for doing research that look at people's activity space segregation because you really need to track where people are in their daily life. So my general conclusion is that the current literature has done a great job theorizing and thinking about activity space, but we have just started to have great data sources, including those that I was talking with Dodo about things that she's having in mind. There are like multiple places where people have just starting to think about what technology can enable us to collect better data that track where people move. So this is actually a great time to kind of revisit some of these long-standing questions. And most importantly, activity space is particularly important for thinking about social inequality because it prompts us to think about structural barriers that shape where people go. For example, if you think of income as a stratifier, high-income people they have all the resources to travel to different places. They probably own a car or have access to reliable transportation. But poor people, according to recent research, actually don't even have secure means of transportation in a lot of parts of the world. And in the United States, for example, the transportation insecurity has putting much greater limits on economically disadvantaged people's daily mobility than those who are in wealthier families or wealthy neighborhoods. There are also research showing that racial minorities, for example, might avoid traveling to a certain community and usually majority white or more advantaged in terms of resources because they fear the consequences of being stigmatized and marginalized in that community. So this activity space provides not only an opportunity to describe what is going on, but also an opportunity to look into some of the structural barriers that's really enabling or limiting people's daily lives that jointly shape their well-being. So this is a toy and very simple toy example of how activity space may differ from residential space. So these are donuts. So these are donut plots. So these are donuts. Each donut represents a neighborhood. The one on the left here I'm using, this is the focal community. So this is the community that individual lives, which is a majority Black community with 0.6 Black population. And there are two nearby communities, one with 0.8, so 80% Black, and the other was only 30% Black. So the exposure in the individual's own community would be 60% of Blacks and 30% whites in that community. But really, who these people are potentially exposed to are also determined by how frequent these people travel to these different nearby locations. So in this first example, I'm showing cases with these edges in this very tiny network represent the flow of individuals traveling between different communities. So and if you put weights on these neighboring communities, according to how often these individuals travel to these communities, then you get a summary of what we call activity space exposure, which is around 60% Blacks. So very similar to this individual's own community. But if this individual or if these individuals are making more trips to this majority white neighborhood, then the resulting average exposure to Black in the activity space reduces to 0.5 to 50%. So even if people are living in the same type of communities, who they interact with in their daily life are shaped importantly by how often they travel to different places. And in this example, for example, it is actually consistent with what we found in the data, which I'll share later, which is people actually, so racial minorities in the US actually travel to more diverse. So they travel to neighborhoods with a greater share of whites in their daily community. Part of the reason is that a lot of this resources and schools and services happen to be more concentrated in majority white neighborhoods. So they have to travel outside of their neighborhood to get access to those resources. So these activity space exposure will provide a better representation of not just what resources are available in their homes or around their homes, but also in their the places that they go. So what kind of data can enable us to better study this? So the data that we're going to use, and I'm going to use for most of the part of my, this Wilmington Grant project, is this mobile phone data. So this data has been, I think right now it has been making its way into sociology and demographic studies in recent years. Because the data provides really nicely, it provides the mobility flow of individuals from origin to destination. On the aggregate level, the origin to destinations are census block groups, which in the United States are groups of addresses that contains in the range of 600 to around 3,000 households. So this is the census block groups is the lowest, the finest grained level of geographic units that this data can go down to. They're still pretty large, but they are considered it's reasonable to consider them as communities or neighborhoods. And in fact, if you look at the research in the United States or neighborhood, most of the research have used the census tract, which is actually larger than census block groups. So in some way, this data, while it's on the aggregate level to preserve privacy, does present a fine-grained level of origin to destination mobilities. So now the flows are tracked through people's smartphones. And it's not that hard to identify what we call the home location, which is just where individuals tend to spend their days in a week from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. So that's the most frequent place for this person, which is tagged as the home location. And then the person doesn't have to install an app. So the person only need to have the GPS terminal. There are more fancier, more technical details to that, but basically you can think of that as long as you have a smartphone, you have data, you have the GPS on, you are tracking the data. So it's less selective than mobility data using specific apps. So although there are a lot of drawbacks of this data, a lot of limitations of the data. Like one thing is it is aggregate level. The other thing is not everyone has a smartphone, and there's definitely selection by social background into who has a smartphone and who uses that. But with that aside, this data at least provide a way to actually see the network of all the census block groups in the United States. There are a total of around 200,000 census block groups in this country. So this is a big mobility network, and they can be nested into different MSAs, so metropolitan areas. They can also be aggregated into cities or counties or however way you want to organize them. But at the finest grain level, this data allows for a census block group level mobility network. So this is our main data. And then we link the data to community characteristics in the American Community Survey. So this is like the census data, some come from the census. It has the detailed information about the income and race and occupation, a lot of compositional measures of each census block group. So these can be nicely linked. And in cases where we need larger level, more aggregate level characteristics, we can also always turn to the same data source, but calculate different measures at different levels, such as the metropolitan area, which I'll talk about later. So basically, the data is what enables me, and not just myself, but a large group, an emerging group of researchers nowadays on trying to look at segregation in activity space across the country. And I think there are data in other parts of the world coming up as well. So, and this is a toy, example of how this data differs from previous data. You might have heard of some, residential location data when you can identify where people live, and you can match that to their nearest neighbors, so who are close to them, and you can literally measure the actual physical distance between locations. There are also data on communities, so you can collect all the data of all addresses in the neighborhood, and then calculate measures. And you might have also seen data that track people over time to see which communities are they moving to over time. But that mobility data is less real time and much less frequent than the data that we have, which is where people go in their everyday life. So, so this is kind of a nice addition to the existing volume of data that's available to study neighborhood, to study space and segregation. We're going to rely on a set of measures. I skipped the methods details, but these are the key things that we focus on. So the first one is called Mobility Connectedness Index, the MCI, which is basically tells you how the relative frequency of individuals from community P visiting community Q. So these are the edges. So if you're a network person, these are the edges in the network connecting different census block groups. So the higher the MCI, the more likely individuals from community P are to travel to community Q in their daily lives. And we calculate this local mobility exposure, which is the MSE, which is basically a weighted composition of group M, where the weights are proportional to two things. The first is the mobility connected index. So the higher, the more likely you're going to visit a place, the higher the weights are placed to that community. The other is the population density in the destination community. So the population density kind of gives us an idea of how many people on average are you going to meet in a given square meter or a given geographic area. So it gives you a kind of capturing something about the actual exposure to people. So local community mobility exposure in this way, basically it just on average, what proportion, what share in the total among all the people that you meet in your daily travels, what proportion would be from group M, and you can calculate that for different groups, for different communities. We can also do a region-wide mobility exposure, which is usually calculated when you're studying geographic variations. You can do the average, again, average and average weighted by population density of all all census block groups in a region. The region can be a county, a city, or a metropolitan area. So this gives an idea of, on average, how often do, say, Black people interact with white people in their daily life in this region. So these measures, we have that more in the paper. These measures are kind of a mobility version of the standard residential segregation. So that makes it easier for us to make comparisons between our mobility measures and say traditional segregation measures, which I'll show later. Okay. Oh yeah, actually gonna show them now. So these are like, I'm gonna talk about some descriptives on the data because I think they're helpful for us to get a sense of, what are these mobility-based measures are actually capturing. So here, the black and red lines are contrasting two types of exposures and the first panel is by race and the second panel is by income. And for each of the plots, so each of the subplot on this panel, they corresponds to exposure to whites, exposure to blacks, exposure to Hispanics, and exposure to Asians. So these are the four races that usually considered in the US-based research. The black lines are what would be the exposure, for example, in here, this black line means what would be this one is the first one, this one. So what would be the exposure of whites to whites, so to their own group, if we capture exposure based on their physical distance? So here, when I'm weighting communities, I'm only using inverse measure of the distance, actual distance between the two locations. It's the inverse measure because the farther you're away, the less weights I'm going to give you. So this is what we call distance-based measures. So the black line tells you that basically, if you compare this black line with the other lines, what you're going to interpret is that whites are exposed to much more whites in their daily lives than blacks and Hispanics and Asians are exposed to whites. But then the red lines are what would be the exposure if you use the mobility weights. So you actually weight the exposure by how often people travel to different places. So this is the red lines. So now we're going to talk about general conclusions across the board. So one general pattern that's quite consistent is that the exposure to own group, so basically whites exposure to whites, blacks exposure to blacks, so these are like social or racial isolation. So groups exposure to their own groups are actually milder if you look at mobility instead of distance. So what does it mean? It means that whites don't want to live with, or they're not living close to other racial minorities. They're living closer to whites in their daily life. But they're probably traveling to a more diverse communities in their daily life so that they actually get to meet more racial minorities in their daily activities than in their residential, in their home location. So in some way, individuals are meeting a more diverse group of people in terms of, out-group members, people that are of the different race in their daily commute than in their home location. So basically, activity space is actually less segregated than residential space. And that same pattern is also here for income. So for income group, and this is a pattern that consistent with a lot of, not a lot, but several recent studies that are using different data. So basically activity space, people are actually less segregated. People are integrating a little bit more than we observe in their residential space. But also not by too much. For example, if you look at here, there's still a gradient between in-group and out-group exposure. So still in their activity space, especially at the top and lower ends of the distribution. So if you think of race, that's whites versus blacks in the United States. If you think of incomes, that's the highest income versus low income, especially at the two ends, individuals are still quite segregated in their activity space. So high income people still are more exposed to high income people in their daily activity than low income people. So they're definitely not mingling as much as to generate an even distribution. So, and the next question is, do mobility-based segregation correlate strongly with distance-based segregation? So basically, do communities that communities that have a greater level of isolation, also in terms of their physical space, also tend to have a greater isolation in their activity space. So the distribution, so the correlation is actually not low, it's quite high. So let's look at the blue lines first. So the blue lines are the correlation, the total exposure, the correlation between distance-based and mobility-based measure at the census block group level, so at the community level. It's not low, it's like 0.75 and above, so which is actually not quite high. But The reason that it looks high is only because those mobility-based measures actually include both mobility within the same neighborhood as well as across to different neighborhoods. So when people tend to also stay in their own neighborhoods in their daily lives, and this counts them in. So basically, a large part of that measure captures the distance-based segregation, and that's why the correlation is pretty high. Once you exclude those within community movements, so if you look at only at when people go out of their homes, what kind of communities do they go to? The correlation drops to, the average is 0.3 something, to drop to pretty low levels. And what's more interesting, I think, is so this plot is looking at income from lowest to highest quartiles. So what you can see here is that the correlation between mobility-based exposure and distance-based exposure is lower when you move from lower to higher income. And similarly for race as well. So for those racially more advantaged groups like whites, the correlation between mobility and distance-based segregation is also much lower than the racial minorities. So what this is telling us is that mobility and distance-based measures are capturing quite different dimensions. The correlation is actually pretty low if you only look at out-of-neighborhood movements. But also that the more advantaged groups' mobility are less constrained by their physical space, right? So the higher the correlation is, the greater people's mobility aligns with their physical space, physical distance. The lower this correlation, the less constraints the physical space is imposing on the individual's daily mobility. And who has the lowest correlation? Those more advantaged groups. So this is actually telling us that not only are they capturing different things, but they also stands out as a dimension of high inequality in terms of whose mobility is constrained more by physical distance. I feel like I need to speed up because I'm looking at the clock and I haven't even got to the second part yet. Oh, good. So now I'm moving to my second part. Anyway, so the first part, what I'm trying to say is just to give you a sense of how these two measures differ and kind of establish this concept. And the second thing is moving to the more empirical question that I'm interested in this general project, which is what does inequality do to our connectedness as people, as communities? So in the most part of my previous work, I've been focusing on I've been focusing more on, trajectories of people, outcomes at the individual level, outcomes at the family level. But the next part of my kind of research agenda is trying to think about how inequality is affecting people's relationship with each other. So how is inequality harming our connectedness? Is inequality generating more isolation? So I'm thinking about those questions, and that requires us to measure people's actual activities. So if you look at the literature, there really hasn't been any study that we are aware of that look at this, which is great. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a contribution. And there hasn't even been really a lot written on the theoretical parts yet. But there has been tons of studies that look at residential income inequality on residential segregation. So basically places with higher inequality, the more advantaged group and disadvantaged group tend to live in very different places. So that's the general conclusion. But then we look at the literature really closely. And what we saw is that in a lot of work, once you control for a large set of location-specific characteristics, that relationship is not that stable. So sometimes it just disappears. There's non-significance. So basically the conclusion is that inequality increases segregation in residential space, but a lot of that increase might also be driven by a lot of other comparing factors. So descriptively, there seems to be a correlation, but it's not that stable. But then we can think of the activity space, which actually give us a lot of thoughts on mechanisms that are beyond residential location. So for example, when you have rising inequality, which is driving residential segregation a little bit, maybe that segregation may be translated into more segregation in activity space because people need to live in relatively closer locations to be able to visit each other. So maybe there is a mechanism in which residential segregation may even exacerbate activity space segregation. So inequality may be affecting activity space segregation. And the second reason is think about schools. This is one of the most and densely studied topic in residential segregation, which is people live in places with schools that have different qualities. So the segregation of schools, which is one of the primary location where a lot of inequality in education and human capital happens, is also the place where a lot of divide between the rich people and poor people happen, right? So if inequality increases the segregation of schools, we would expect poor and rich people, when they have kids, are going to very different places, and that could also lead to segregation. And the other thing is there's not just schools. So if you look at the literature, there has been some studies showing how, a lot of resources and institutions such as hospitals and banks are just very unevenly distributed. And I think this is not just in the US. I think this is pretty true across the world when, the good, high quality hospitals and, banks with good financial services tend to concentrate spatially in places that have a greater proportion of high income people. So that inequality might make the distribution more unequal, and in some way, it might drive the poor and rich to go to very different services. And this is especially true if you look at, say, hospitals, where at least in the United States, there are public hospitals and private hospitals. And I know Hong Kong has that too, and in a lot of parts of the world. So whenever you think things that can be partially privatized, when you have a high inequality, there's going to be a greater divide in terms of the kind of care or kind of service that's available in private sector versus the public sector. And there's also going to be a greater divide in which kind of institutions do rich or poor people or racial minority or versus majority people go to, because those two places are increasingly divided in the quality of service as well as in the cost of their service. So we actually think activity space actually speak to a lot of more, a lot of the mechanisms that are really beyond, that are more sociological in some way, because they're more capturing a broader range of people's life. And that's definitely beyond where people actually live. Okay, so that's what leads us to really want to do this project. So I'm going to use the same data that I described, and I'm just going to construct 2 additional measures. So these measures are going to be on a metropolitan area level, so a region level or geographic location level, because I'm going to compare the inequality across different geographic locations and link that variation to the variation of isolation calculated from my smartphone data. So the absolute isolation of group M is basically in this region, how much intra-group exposure there is for group M. So how much exposure to Blacks are experienced by Blacks? And that's a measure of isolation, because the greater, the more isolated Blacks are to Blacks. But that measure doesn't account for the fact that Black people also tend to live in places with a greater Black population in general, right? So it doesn't account for the marginal distribution of Blacks in that region. So you would not be surprised if you see a greater share of Black to Black exposure in places with a high Black concentration, because they're kind of already determining each other. So the relative isolation of group M kind of parts that part out. So this part, we're looking at the exposure between 2 groups. For example, I think the example is easier to say. So we want to talk about Blacks' relative isolation in terms of the difference between Blacks' exposure to Blacks and the Whites' exposure to Blacks. So basically, this is using the exposure to Blacks from other groups, especially the majority group. It parses out the part of mobility that's purely driven by the composition of the region, because these 2 groups we're looking at those groups in the same region. So if Blacks are exposed to an even greater share of Blacks than Whites in the same region are to Blacks, this additional exposure by Blacks to Blacks captures the kind of the net isolation of the groups. So both are important in terms of, even if you want to interpret, they're both capturing some intra-group, so within group exposure. But the second one, I think, is a cleaner measure because it kind of separates out that structural exposure. So this is, if you like mobility tables, this is like margin structural versus exchange mobility in this geographic sense. So, okay, so some results. So the first plot is just to see how these on these two axes is, for example, if you look at black, so the left is for race and right is for income. So we're basically plotting Blacks' relative exposure against Blacks' absolute exposure. And the same here. So Q1 is the lowest income group. So we're plotting that group's relative exposure and its absolute exposure, and with the histograms around here. So all we're saying here is that we can see that these two measures are kind of correlated. There is a moderate positive association, but as you can see, there's a lot of wiggling room around this line, which means that they capture quite different aspects. And this kind of strengthens our point of calculating that relative exposure measure in addition to this raw absolute measure. So this is just saying they're capturing different things. And this part I think is interesting. So this is kind of doing what we have shown you before about the comparison between distance and mobility-based measures. But now I'm showing them at the metropolitan area level. So sorry, I forgot to mention. So metropolitan areas are areas, you can think of them as different geographic units that's bounded. You know, they're basically, they're all urban areas, I should mention. So they're all urban areas. We excluded rural areas because mobility patterns very different in the United States between rural and urban. And they're large enough so that they're capturing not just people living in a single city, but they're also capturing people who are kind of commuting in their lives in this general areas. Like New York City, around New York City, there's a New York, New Jersey metropolitan area, which covers basically, you know, a lot of counties in around this area when people just constantly travel. So there are like 384, I think 384, yeah, MSAs in the United States. Anyway, so each dot represent a metropolitan area. And what's interesting is that I draw this 45-degree line. So this 45-degree line, if these dots, and then the y-axis is mobility-based exposure, x-axis is distance-based. The upper plot is race, the lower plot is income. So the race plot is more dramatic. So if these dots are concentrated here, it is below the 45-degree line. That means the distance-based measures is less than the mobility-based measures. So the first plot is Blacks' exposure to Blacks. As you can see, this confirms our prior finding in this community level descriptive piece, which is that the Blacks' exposure to Blacks is actually lower if we look at actually where they go than if we just simply look at who they're close to in their location. And similarly, if you look at whites' exposure to Blacks, Hispanics, and Asian to whites, mobility-based exposure is greater, meaning that although whites don't live around Blacks in their residential location, they don't tend to live in the same place. In their daily mobility, they do tend to be exposed to more Blacks, which is push them above the 45-degree line than in their distance, in their physical distance. So similarly for income, this is just confirming us that not only at the community level, but also at the MSA level, there is this milder segregation in activity space. And this is just the plot. I should have shown this earlier. So each of these colored regions are metropolitan areas. As you can see, there's so many white areas, and those are places where do not belong to the metropolitan area, and which is not surprising because we have a lot in the United States. There's a larger area in this rural side. So the urban side are actually more concentrated and denser. So if you look at on the map, they're actually very sparse, kind of sparse, but they're actually very dense within. So these are just maps of these different measures. If we show this before. Okay, now jumping to the key results, which is, so as we see here, people are exposed to less. They're less segregated in activity space. But what I'm going to show next is that people's activity space are actually significantly influenced by income inequality in that region. In the next slides that I'm going to show, I'm going to tell you that sensitivity, so the activity space is actually more sensitive to economic inequality than residential space. So which we think is one of the most important takeaway from this paper is, first, we did this, we can talk about them individually, but the general picture is that here I'm looking at different measures of income inequality. and looking at how they affect the isolation of Blacks and whites, or the isolation of the rich neighborhood and poor neighborhoods. So if there's a positive effect, that means inequality increases segregation in activity space, which is pretty true across the board. There's some insignificant findings, but if you look at the first two plots are income inequality, general inequality, especially if you look at the relative isolation, which is the cleaner measure. What's interesting is that for both, I forgot to put a race plot in, but for both race and income, they increases the isolation of the most disadvantaged group as well as the most advantaged group. So the first two plots shows you inequality, increased segregation, isolation at both ends. So if you're rich, or if you're super rich, or if you're super poor. And the next two plot is a very interesting contrast, which is relevant to some of my ongoing work, which is I'm breaking down income inequality into this 90-50 ratio and 50-10 ratio. So the 90-50 ratio is the inequality at the upper end. So how far away is the 90th percentile from the middle? And the next one is how far away is the 10th percentile from the middle? So I want to capture this potential asymmetry in this effect. And what we found is that it's very interesting that the rich people, so if you look at the poor first, for example, the lower side income ratio only affects poor people. So if the lowest income groups are falling behind in terms of income levels in the region, then the poor people are significantly more isolated, which makes sense. And it doesn't affect rich people. What's most interesting is this rich people, this upper side effect. Basically, when you have a greater inequality income gap at the upper end, it hurts everybody. So even if we're looking at 90% income ratio in income, which are far away from those low income neighborhoods, but if you have a greater inequality at that 90%, it's going to significantly affect the isolation of poor people. And I'm going to show you with some more results from another paper that I'm working on, which is basically, which is why I'm now kind of working on this theoretical argument, which is rich people are hurting poor people, even if they don't meet each other in their daily lives. And we think about the mechanism, and we think of the mechanisms, especially those about privatization of hospitals, schools, services, right? You can think of a lot of this privatization is driven by the market. So that means a lot of this, hospitals are becoming private hospitals and resources are flowing to this private hospital and schools because there's a highly income inequality at the top end. The poor people suffer, even if it has nothing to do with the, in some way, they don't have much interaction with the 90%. The 90% expansion hurts them in a way that transcends beyond transcends beyond the individual income spectrum. Whereas the poor people, the lower side inequality basically hurts the poor, but it doesn't affect the high people. So that's one of the findings that's quite salient. And this is the finding that I said earlier, which is the left, for each plot, the left coefficient is the coefficient of inequality on distance based. So basically where they actually live, who are they close to. So this is how inequality leads to segregation in terms of physical space. And in each plot, the right coefficient is the coefficient on activity space. So across the board, this is baseline model, this is model with more controls. What we found is the effect of inequality on activity space segregation is much greater and also more salient than the effect on residential segregation. Which also I think is interesting because we have just shown that mobility-based segregation is milder. It is lower in terms of level, but mobility-based segregation is actually more sensitive when you have a greater inequality in this region. So this kind of points towards the importance of why we move to study inequality and activity space, because we might have underestimated the effect of economic inequality if we had only looked at residential space. Okay, so what we have learned so far, this is a quick recap. So we just showed activity space captures a quite important and distinct dimension of segregation. It varies substantially across metropolitan areas. economic inequality increases absolute and relative segregation for both the most advantaged and most disadvantaged groups. And that effect is greater for activity-based segregation than for residential segregation. And this also kind of shows how the mobility data and the smartphone data actually is helping us to understand some of the very traditional questions about segregation. I think I'm about to go over time, so maybe I'll have like 3 minutes to quickly go over what this connecting to the broader picture. So what's next? So there are a lot of things on my to-do list, but these are the 2 projects that are immediately relevant. The first one is we're thinking about how that effect of inequality on segregation is translating into differences in intergenerational mobility. So we're looking at we're looking at polarization, so the asymmetry of income distribution across the country. So this is the income polarization measure. And we're looking at how, I'm skipping this, we're looking at the effect of income inequality at upper and lower end on mobility. And this is our existing analysis. So what we did is we look at the upper side, so the inequality at top end and inequality at lower end, and what hurts people's mobility more. And when I say mobility, I mean upward mobility. So people from lowest class, lowest income group. So first, upper side expansion hurts mobility of lower side, even if they don't actually interact, as we see in the previous result, they don't interact much in their life. But upper 20% expansion hurts mobility for upward mobility for poor individuals. But what's interesting here is we try to control for a lot of mechanisms that are standards in mobility research, and these are like from large sample data. They don't seem to explain a lot, and we're not happy about that. So what we're going to do next is to see maybe part of what we're missing. So the segregation measure is actually one of them that has some effect, but not really much. So this segregation is residential segregation. So what we are trying to see is whether part of this mechanism is through activity-based segregation, which is not captured right now. So this is what we're moving, is to say we're not happy, we're not explaining much, which is bothering and frustrating. But we think that we might have missed a lot of things that are happening in people's daily life that's stratified by income inequality. So that's one direction. Okay, so the other direction is, which is quite different but related, is this political polarization. So this is a published paper that appeared this year. I'm working with Josh, the same Yongjin Zhang. So Josh Zhang, who is a co-author on this paper, and Wenhao Zhang and Zhi Li, both of them are grad students at NYU. So we look at political segregation. So whether people in the United States, whether people are meeting someone from the opposite party. So, and we calculate different measures. So we use the same data, except that now we're looking at places. So the data also has what we call points of interest. So they have the specific locations that people visit. So is it a grocery store? Which grocery store? Is it a museum? Which museum? It has very detailed info on those things, and they have address. So basically, you can look at where people go to and whether that's which places are more segregating or more meaning uneven distribution of Democrats and Republicans versus others. You can also regenerate the community-based measure, which is from each community, which places do people visit. So they're different. This is slightly different structure of data. It's the same data, but we structure it differently. But the reason that I think is relevant is that if we look at the correlation of political segregation, which is a big thing in the United States right now, it's on the rise, it has been concerning. It actually correlates very low. It has a very low correlation with racial and income segregation that I have just shown you. So political segregation definitely stands out as a quite distinct dimension. So what we think, or what I think at least, is important, so this low correlation is important. It means political polarization, segregation should be studied independently. But this is also not looking at this unequal influences on different group of individuals. So these are not interactions. So these are just pure correlations. So what I think might be happening is political polarization may also, like income inequality, it may also affect low and high income groups or racial minorities and majorities very differently. So even if there has been very low correlation between political polarization and racial and income segregation, that might be some interactions. That's also because a lot of the segregation in activity space are affected by policy. So we're thinking about what are the policy basis or political basis of segregation in activity space. Good, I'm running out of time, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, perfect time management. So thank you for sharing your most recent research with us. Very inspiring. I learned a lot. I think we can now open the floor for questions. And you can either just unmute yourself, or you can type in your questions into the chat box. Yeah. So do we have any questions from the floor?
And can I jump in here?
Sure.
Thank Dr. Cheng. I really enjoyed the presentation, and especially the new measures that you're proposing and the interpretations that you're putting on them. So I had a couple of questions. The first one is, the actual data that you use to calculate these mobility segregation based on activity spaces. I'm guessing the data gets updated quite regularly. So in time, you'll be able to look at changes in these indices as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good point. No, so we actually have the most recent data, but we kind of intentionally dropped them because the pandemic, it's affected everything. So I forgot to mention, we use data up to 2020. The first few months of 2020 is basically what we use, because we want to intentionally avoid the pandemic effect. But that would be actually most important, is to look at pandemics on segregation. There has been papers, I think David Grusky and a few co-authors has published a paper using that. So part of the greatness of the data is actually to study changes over time, as you mentioned. We didn't look at change over time because we want to avoid pandemic for this analysis right now.
And my second question is I was really interested in the scatter plots that you showed with the correlation between the mobility-based segregation index and the standard residential distance-based segregation indices. And I'm particularly interested in the communities or the metropolitan areas that have a perfect correlation, that are on that 45-degree line, because that would imply that these are communities where people are stuck in their residential neighborhoods, that they don't go out of their residential neighborhoods to work and so on. And so I'm particularly interested in whether that's a correct interpretation, that in some way where you have this perfect correlation between the perfect equality between the residential and mobility segregation index, are people generally stuck in those communities? Are they're probably very poor, or maybe extremely rich, or where they don't need to go to work, or and maybe those are interesting cases to look at.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. So we don't have exactly one, that'll be horrible, but we have like close to one. That's true. So so people, it could be either stuck in place, or they just happily living in their space. They don't even go out. But they happen in both sides. I want to say they happen in both sides. So it could be isolation, which is, especially bad for poor people or, disadvantaged people. But it could also be the rich people who just don't, they have all the resources they need in their small blocks in New York City. I can even visualize what neighborhood it is. But you can think of places when they can spend most of their time where they're close to. I think there's some recent work, for example, Pat Sharkey, I think, who is also working on something, and we so generally, I think scholars are starting to notice it's rich people, so advantaged people are also kind of have this closure around them. So they tend to actually close them out from the rest of the world. And which is interesting. I want to mention another study, I think it's maybe forthcoming by Thomas Kovacs-Stevie, which is totally relevant, but also relevant. So I think what they found, part of the finding is that a lot of the rich people tend to work in the same company. So And this is also kind of a closure, which is we have this geographic parallel to that, which is a lot of rich people are just moving around in their social bubble and circle, which is also concerning.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for questions, Karani. And actually, I have a follow-up question to ask. So besides this rich poor divide, I was wondering whether age structure also will affect your result, because older people, especially retired people, they tend to be bonded more closely to their residential neighborhood, and therefore they interact with their residential neighborhood more frequently than people who actually need to work outside their residential neighborhoods, and also children. Yeah, so I wonder whether you consider how age structure affect your results.
Yeah, this is very good point, because this is part of the limitation of the data, but this should actually be studied. So first, we can only get aggregate measures, so old people community instead of old people. Because of privacy issues, we can't look at individuals, so we have to look at the communities. But we can still look at older community, and there are a bunch of these very old, typically old people, high age community, which are that's a very big common. I think somewhere down the road, we're gonna look at that. They're both they need more resources, but they're also more constrained in their daily mobility. Well, it depends on sometimes they have transportation, so it could be helpful, but so that's the part. The other thing is it's very interesting. You can look at both sides, the old and the young, and there's definitely we're looking at this right now. It's the age spectrum, and I can show you one very cute, interesting finding from that. So we look at different places that people tend to visit, like people from different age groups tend to visit. Like daycare centers is one of the most segregated. But the other one of the most segregated center, which might surprise you, is the funeral services. So when people die, this is one of the most segregated places in the United States in terms of income race, which makes sense, right? So the death is not just about, so assuming deaths happen to people with from older ages more, but they're not just about older age people. It's also about their accumulated network of people that care about them, who went. So it's right. So anyway, just to say, it's very extreme at both ends that you can see high segregation or lower.
Yeah. Very interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience? I see some questions in the chat box. Maybe I can just read out. So thanks for your insightful presentation. I'm interested in the point you mentioned, the impacts of school segregation on activity space segregation. I want to ask if there are some results on it. What is the mechanism behind it?
Yeah, no, we don't have empirical results yet. It is hard because we have only aggregate level data, so we can identify the schools that are zoned for a specific community if they're school zones, so which is also on our to-do list, but we haven't done that yet. We can do that at individual level, but we can do that at the school zone level at least. But I think they're going to be, so one of the mechanism is what we're going to test is just the segregation. Rich people and poor people go to very different schools, which is not surprising. But then, how that segregation is affected by a lot of contextual factors, such as, just the distribution of earnings in the local area, as well as the public provision of services, like places in the United States. If you have a stronger public school system, that might be, or not necessary, but might be a lower segregation if the public school is actually functioning, which make it less intense for the private versus public thing. But yeah, so the school thing is what we suspect is going to be a big one of the big mechanism, because that's just so salient. If you study stratification, school parents think a lot of schools segregation is greater among parents than among married people without kids. So yeah, so we don't have results, but we have a lot of suspected mechanisms and hypotheses.
But this reminds me of one of my old projects on the school segregation in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is a special case where you don't actually observe severe residential segregation, but we have very high level of school segregation. Rich kids and poor kids, they go to totally different schools. And that's because high quality schools, especially those private schools, they're concentrated in certain region of the city. And originally I thought it might be like school choice, that the richer kids tend to go to schools outside their home district. But now I think it might be useful to think about the activity space concept. And that could explain why we still observe high level of school segregation in the absence of severe residential segregation in Hong Kong.
Yeah, exactly. I want to quote you because you're exactly giving an example where the physical space doesn't matter. What matters is where people want to go to school or send their kids.
Yeah. And I also have a question myself. So I was thinking about, so when you talk about activity spaces less segregated than the residential space, I was thinking about the implication of this. So of course, I don't find it too surprising because good job opportunities are usually concentrated in more affluent neighborhoods. And for poor people, they have to travel outside their home district to go to their more affluent neighborhoods for better employment opportunities. But if you think about the implication of it, dining in a fancy restaurant and serving tables in a fancy restaurant are totally different. And I just wonder, is it necessarily a good thing to encourage more integrated or a lower level of segregation of activity space? Or I don't know if there's data on like how that would affect people's well-being, subjective well-being, or things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. It could backfire, right? If it looks like they're integrating, but they're actually seeing more social debate. Exactly. I think there's this other theory on this compelled mobility. So people tend to move, poor people just have to go to different places because they don't have a bank in their neighborhood. Like they just have to find a bank that is located in the middle class neighborhood. So it's so it's not necessarily good news that they're going to different places and they maybe spend more time traveling, which is another thing. So so one of the things that we were planning to test, I think maybe people have done that, is to look at weekend versus weekdays. So I think weekends, like segregation in weekends will be much greater than segregation in the weekdays because they go to jobs and there's just a lot of things that you do but it could also be the other way because people also go to stadiums to watch football games on weekends, and that's more integrating. So poor people and rich people that's a good social exposure actually because they're more equal. They're just watching the same game. But so we are also thinking. So there's this feature in this data when you can separate out weekend from weekdays. You can even separate out the hour of the day. For example, you can be looking at the time where people drop off their kids. Like that's a good thing to look at where they are. So anyway, so you can look at different times to get what you're saying. So just they're in a lot of working time, their interaction, but when they're in leisure, they just don't.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I saw a raised hand, Jia Wang.
Hello. Hi, Siwei. Thank you so much for this insightful talk. I have one quick question. So in the book, The Truly Disadvantaged by William Wilson, he argued that the young Black men trapped in the inner city didn't have many work opportunities. So this group could be viewed as the truly disadvantaged group. But using the new concept, the activity space, actually you found milder segregation between race and income groups. And also the economic inequality appears to hurt both ends of the income distribution and also hurt different racial groups. So can I interpret your findings as maybe it's not right, but so in this new set of findings, do your findings challenge the concept of the truly disadvantaged, like there's no really truly disadvantage argued by William Wilson in the maybe 1970s. So things changing now in the United States by using this new concept. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Good to see you. Yeah, yeah, we thought about Wilson because you have to cite Wilson when you're doing urban inequality. Yeah, but Wilson focused more on jobs, but what we have on the smartphone data can be jobs plus a lot of other errands that people just run in their life, like hospital, whatever. Like first, it's not so Wilson focused on where people work and especially where the job opportunities are. But what the activity space captures is actually more than work. So it's like people are, especially they travel to a lot of diverse places. So one thing is this is not, so we don't frame it as direct test because we don't have the data, but you're right. So we are actually trying to have, in a separate project, we are trying to look at the test Wilson's argument. But that requires better data, like not just this data, because we can separate out. So we're looking at the occupation distribution of different neighborhoods and different firms. So we're looking at employers. Just to get a sense of, combined. So we have this job posting data. So where are job vacancies coming out of? So you can link that to different places. So I think that's probably a better direction to combine the data with that. But today I just read a paper by an economist, which actually showed that. So with all this online hiring and remote working, all this, I think the Wilson's argument will be even more salient in some way if the higher skilled workers have access to these jobs and they can even work remotely. So they're less constrained by their physical location, where the poor usually work on jobs that are already, a lot of that are more in the manual sector when they just have to do service work in person and they're constrained by mobility. So I think in some way there are a lot of new things in this data that can be then test this, the Wilson argument, which came up in the 1980s, that doesn't incorporate these new technologies that shape work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jia. So any other questions? If no, I think we can stop here. Sorry for keeping you so late.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, but I think although the concept of activity space originally invented by geographers, I think it's becoming a very trendy, very sexy topic in urban sociology. And I can imagine that you're going to publish a lot of great papers on this topic. And hope that in the future we'll have the honor to invite you to Hong Kong and chat a little bit more about it. Okay, so
yeah,
thank you.
That would be totally my honor. Thank you, Dodo. Thank you for inviting. Thanks, everyone.